Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Lane. I'm an organizer and member of Community Coalition. We're a community-based organization in South Los Angeles. We were founded 25 years ago during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in South Los Angeles. And for the last 25 years, we have organized everyday residents and social service providers to find community-based solutions to address the root causes of crime in South Los Angeles. We have waged these bold campaigns to disrupt various pathways or pipelines to incarceration by reforming public education, foster care, and the criminal justice system. More importantly, South Los Angeles residents have worked over the last 25 years to hold government accountable for the chronic neglect of poor and working communities, which threatens outcomes for young people, but also traps families in cycles of perpetual poverty. The most severe, I think, consequence of the failed war on drugs was really the systematic attack on young people and the criminalization of people of color and young people of color. I can remember being a young person growing up in South LA and remembering suddenly not being able to walk down the streets in groups without being contacted by the police, and not being able to go to the park anymore because of fear of violence in the park. And so I really can vividly remember South Los Angeles really transforming from a community where families played outside to really houses becoming more fortified with black gates, and just the overpresence of police and what that impact that had on me as a young person. But I also think it's unfortunate now, 25 years later, 30 years later, that if we were talking about white adolescents, we wouldn't necessarily be talking about criminal justice and the juvenile justice system. And unfortunately, it's become commonplace when we talk about conditions of young people of color, we necessarily talk about juvenile justice and crime. So as a result of that trend, Community Coalition, along with community and faith-based organizations across South Los Angeles, the county, and even the state, have really, from the very beginning, fought against this idea of throwing away generations of young people to the criminal justice system. And our central strategy has been not advocacy, but organizing, and really bringing the people who are most impacted by these conditions at the forefront to identify the solutions and win campaigns. But more importantly, the outcome of organizing is really the development of leaders to continue campaigns, to continue leading the charge to bring about change in their own community. And so some of the young people that were part of our very first campaigns around demanding access to college education, college preparatory courses in South LA schools actually walked the halls of this building, and some of them actually support many of you in your work. Others who were involved in one of our first campaigns to document the decaying of school conditions in South Los Angeles, where tiles were falling on students' heads, where there was one working bathroom for thousands of students. Those young men now are leading community and faith-based organizations around social justice. Most recently, young people, part of organizing groups across LA County, organized their peers and themselves to eliminate willful defiance as a basis for suspension. And it was the young people themselves that identified, hey, I'm being put out of class because I've had my hood on, or I had my hat on and I refuse to take it off, and how that contributed to pushing our young people out of school and into the streets and increasing contact with law enforcement. It was the young people themselves that identified the problem and also identified the solution and waged a campaign and actually won the change. It was also young people in Los Angeles County who organized themselves and their peers and their parents to resist and fight truancy sweeps, where young people who had responsibility or who had to take the bus and the bus ran late and they were encountered with law enforcement at their schools and being held at the gate and not being able to go into their classrooms. Again, it was the young people that identified those barriers to accessing education, and it was the young people themselves that organized and got their peers to actually win change. Alliance for Boys and Men of Color brings together young people, boys and men of color, across the state of California. And the most important thing I think that vehicle provides is for young people across the state to sit and talk about leadership. And what does it mean to be a community leader and to fight for sustainable change in their community? And so our young people have been bold and innovative in their solutions and in their work. And so now it's time for our leaders and the adults in our community and our leaders in the state to match their boldness and match their innovation. And in particular, I'd be amiss to not talk about Timothy and Alfonso, who are young people in South Los Angeles who not only led our work around willful defiance, but actually built a cadre of young people who walked every Saturday to pass Proposition 47. And it was those young people that organized not only their peers, but their parents who've been impacted by incarceration, but knocked on doors, had house meetings, and engaged everyday residents about what Prop 47 would mean for South Los Angeles. And the two pieces that Timothy typically talked about was one, the investment in prisons has taken away from investments in his school. And the second thing that he always talked about is the piece around investing in young people and youth development. And it's our young people and the residents in South LA who are constantly resisting this frame that poor and working people can only access services once they're under the supervision of a parole officer, a jail bailiff, a sheriff, or a warden at a prison. But that in fact, young people and poor and working people should be able to access the necessary resources that they need in their community without being under the supervision of law enforcement. I want to address a few things that have come up in previous conversations. I want to applaud Assemblymember Reggie Jones-Sawyer for his work to pass in the last budget, AB 1468. And there's been a lot of questions. I think it's even impacting people's support of increasing the funding for the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Fund for community-based programs and faith-based programs. And what the Assemblymember was able to do was pass a bill that actually provided resources for smaller community and faith-based organizations that are already serving these populations. And so in the absence of formal investments in community and faith-based organizations for decades, informal networks of faith-based and community organizations have worked together to meet the service gaps in their community. And there's networks that know that when someone's returning from home, Fair Chance will go to Skid Row and pick that person up, and someone from Fair Chance will connect that person to Shields for housing, and someone from Shields will connect that person to the Coalition for Mental Health Professionals to get family reunification. And so those informal networks between community and faith-based organizations already exist, and they operate with very little resources. Last year, the legislature was able to put $8 million aside, which isn't a lot, but it did set the precedent that there's capacity in local neighborhoods to actually meet the needs of the community. There's people that will come behind me, and I don't want to go too far into it. But again, I also want to emphasize the importance when we talk about young people, are we investing in the things that they want to see in their community? And have we asked our young people what they want to see and what would help improve their outcomes? And I want to challenge the legislature again to not only fully fund the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Fund to the maximum savings that can be allotted, because it does include a piece around youth development, and that it would increase the infrastructure to support our young people in local neighborhoods. But I challenge you to go be just as bold and innovative as our young people and find additional funding for youth development activities and youth jobs across the state of California.
Thank you, Ms. Lane. And we're being joined by Assemblymember Philip Y. Ting and Mr. Mike A. Gibson. We allowed everyone to give say a few words, and then we'll ask questions. Did you want to say anything, Mr. Ting?
I don't want to interrupt the flow, but just to say that I know this is our first meeting of the year, and we have been doing quite a bit of work for the last couple of years, but given what's continuing to go on in our communities, we know there's still significant work to be done. So just very excited to welcome you again to the Capitol, but also know that we have to roll up our sleeves this year and get some stuff done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm excited to come in and hear the enthusiasm and the energy that you bring about the report of South Los Angeles. One who grew up in South Los Angeles, Watts very specifically, know the work of the Community Coalition from the day that Karen Bass walked into my life back in the 80s. And to see it matriculate to its greatest potential right now, providing and standing up for our young people, I'm very, very excited. One, being a part of this committee, and also being able to tackle the issues that affect our young people. Me as a former police officer, me as a former youth pastor of my church, and still my wife and I, we're still very much engaged in young people in the city of Carson now, in the 64th State Assembly District. Look forward to this robust conversation, but also building a greater coalition with those interested parties in the district as well. So thank you very much for being here.
Okay. I want to thank Mr. Ting and Mr. Gibson. As you can see, they're members of the Bowtie Caucus.
Proudly.
Proud members of the Bowtie Caucus.
It's because we were serving food at lunch today.
I believe the Youth Justice Coalition passed out some information, and one of the disturbing things that Mr. Bonta and I were looking at is where it says LA County still locks up more youth than any other place in the world. And I guess the thing that's most disturbing, that 95% of those who are locked up in LA County are either African American or Latino. 95%, which means they're coming from our communities in South LA, East LA. I'm really encouraged at two things that you mentioned, especially since Mr. Bonta and I believe this committee is going to move forward with trying to get $100 million for grants. I'm interested in putting in accountability measures maybe in this $100 million, and how do we do that? And then two, Ms. Lane talked about you're connecting with different services, but it's not formalized, but it's, I don't want to call it underground, but people who do this work, and this God's work, are able to get people to different places and so they can get the services that they can. Is there any way we could do something to help memorialize that, to create, I mean, I'm not trying to create a whole lot of bureaucracy, but it seems like you have the formula for success. I just want to be able to replicate that, not only in LA County, but in other counties that also need that. So accountability money, and then how do we replicate successful programs, and it's our interagency cooperation so we can be most effective.
So I think CSJ can talk a bit about the accountability, because there's been some legislation to help ensure that when the Prop 47 savings comes down, there's some level of accountability. But just to speak to what we've worked with social service providers since they were part of our founding members, and so we've done some community assessments with them to try to get at that. And what we continue to hear is that if the state would integrate streams of funding, and so creating grants that integrate services and incentivize comprehensive approaches to service delivery. So if grants were released that has housing, mental health treatment, family reunification, navigation services, which are what some of these smaller groups help people actually navigate the system within their local communities, that if the money itself, funding streams were actually integrated, it would incentivize, once the money hit the counties, to actually fund regional collaborations. And so it would help with, I think someone also spoke to, some of the smaller groups may not have the infrastructure to be able to do the burdensome reporting requirements that often county contracts might come with. But if a larger agency were incentivized to apply for funding with the smaller agencies who are providing the services, and that larger agency can provide the infrastructure for reporting, it would actually incentivize these regional collaboratives.
Mr. Gibson.
Thank you very much. I was the chairman of the Los Angeles County Community Action Board for over 9 years. That's the agency that provides. Do you receive CDBG funds?
We do not, but several of our partners do.
Right, and that would be an agency that I'm keenly aware of because I have served that agency for many years. That would be that fiscal agent also with accountability and the transparency, because they have monitors and agents that will go out and make sure deliverables and receivables are actually met and holding agencies accountable. And so that may be one of the things that they can look at as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. And did you want to address?
I will briefly address it. I can't speak to any legislation coming down the pipeline, but certainly there's been a lot of discussion around Prop 47 savings and how they'll be spent and what accountability there is. I think it's a sort of chronic problem in the state when we spend money there isn't often. We saw it with realignment. There isn't often any sort of evaluation or follow-up following the money. That's true of a lot of juvenile justice funding streams as well. I know that SB 678, the Probation Subsidy Act, does have some level of evaluation when the savings are split with counties, so that might serve. I think the balance is not being too prescriptive and restricting how the funds are spent, but then also having a piece that says, well, and then afterwards you have to show that you've done what you said you've done. I think a lot of that happens at the administrative agency that is administering the funds, so the Board of State and Community Corrections, for example, or in the case of VOCA, it's the Cal-OES organization that distributes those funding streams. And so when they develop the RFP, they have to include, they can include, these are the requirements, identify the need, and then follow up with the evaluation. So that's where it could happen.
Okay. Ms. Brown?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations today. I wanted to ask the question and say that we need to look at how much we ask the agencies to do. You're saying you give it to the Board of Corrections, and the Board of Corrections then will put the RFP program in place, and then you have to meet whatever. We need to streamline it, because when you start looking at the bureaucracy of the state of California, I can't see that helping the very people that you're talking about.
Yeah, I would also sort of add on to that when you put sort of restrictive evaluative things on local community-based organizations, they don't always have the capacity to be able to supply the information necessary. I think you already spoke to that a little bit.
But, Mr. Chair, but we want to make sure the programs are effective. There's a lot of programs out there, and really it's best practices. For instance, up here they've got some rock climbing programs. I'm not really sure how much rock climbing is going to help somebody in their life overall, but there are some really fabulous programs out there, and everyone's trying to reinvent the wheel. Let's just take the best practices and go forward with that. And that's a winner in my book.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Ms. Brown.
The best practices are what they're saying is happening now.
Yeah.
My concern is that we put something in place that's going to create too much bureaucracy. I know we have to be accountable. I'm all about accountability. However, when you're talking about these small organizations, small churches, small everything, you're not going to be able to get their buy-in.
You got to get something, because we have the fiduciary responsibility to make sure, like I said, a lot of good programs out there and some not so good. So we want to make sure the good ones are succeeding. So I do agree with you. It's a matter of how we get there.
And you're both right, and because I know in the $100 million that I was able to attain for rehabilitation, for example, in LA County, they gave the money to the probation department. They put out an RFP that you needed a PhD from UCLA to be able to fill it out. And so that's, to Mrs. Brown's point, it was so complicated that they still have the $1.3 million. It never got out on the street. And to your point, the reason they made it so complicated, because they wanted to make sure it got to people that actually knew what they were doing and had enough backup information, so they were secure in knowing that once the money was lent out, it would get to the right organizations. And so there's a balancing act that we've got to do. And I think ultimately what the Californians for Safety and Justice are recommending, you meet us halfway, make sure it's not too cumbersome to get it out, and give people an opportunity to succeed. But what we don't do in government, when someone doesn't succeed, we don't fire them. I don't want to sound like Trump, but we don't fire anybody. We don't, organizations that don't work, we don't get rid of them. And, people like me come in and write a letter and advocate on their behalf because they're my friend or my cousin or something like that, when in fact they're doing a disservice to a lot of people in the community. And so we, community leaders, we also have to be able to say, some organization, nonprofit, if they're not working, no matter how many widgets go in and no matter how violent the cause, we've got to shut them down and get some people in to working, which is to what Assemblymember Cooper is saying, that we've got to be a little more vigilant about ensuring that organizations and best practices stay in place and we support them and give money, and ones that don't, we eliminate them as soon as possible.
And so if I can, I do want to echo the importance of thinking outside the box and not doing things as we've done it in order to hold accountability. Because the example that comes to mind most recently is while probation was the department in the example that you gave, Assembly Member, around getting the money out, this $1.6 million and creating these, it was literally a 100-page RFP for a very small amount of money. Well, now and all of that was under the guise of making sure that community and faith-based organizations were using money responsibly. And the money did actually hit the street finally about 2 weeks ago, but then we hear that LA County probation has been sitting on about $161 million of unspent resources that could have been invested in communities. And so we often cannot, what I'm challenging folks is we can't often look to the bureaucracy itself to hold community and faith-based organizations accountable to a standard that they're not meeting themselves. And so how do we think outside the box to create mechanisms to ensure that quality services are happening in the community and actually improve outcomes for people? And I do think it takes, again, innovation, and I think the right approach is around streamlining the process.
Okay, thank you. And unfortunately, we're running out of time, but Mr. Thurman has joined us. You have a few comments, or you have a comment and question?
It's really a question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for what you've provided for us. I wanted to ask you about the point you were just making, because in the cities that I represent, including Richmond, there was an attempt to build a prison when, in fact, the sheriff had sat on what were supposed to be reentry dollars and then said, let us build this new prison. It's going to have a mental health focus. Of course, we said no. This community does not need another prison. I wanted to get your sense about how we could expand wraparound programs for young people who've been detained or incarcerated, and I'm thinking about some of the camps. And so I work with youth at Camp Sweeney in Alameda County, and right now those youth leave Camp Sweeney and do not get the same services that we provide for someone who was in juvenile hall or in foster care to have wraparound job, training, mental health, education to get on a pathway. And it strikes me that we have to provide those same opportunities for our young people, or we'll find them in harm's way again in the system, and your sense about the need for those kind of wraparound services.
So I definitely agree that they're needed. What I talked about previously is that they're needed, and that far too often folks are connecting to services that the formal bureaucracies don't know about. And so is that young person's mother going to their local church to get support, right? And if that's happening, how do we resource local faith-based, these informal networks of faith-based and community-based organizations that are providing those wraparound services but are not getting government contracts to do so? And so I think it's right. I mean, community advocates for decades have been arguing, how do we redirect savings from local jails, the closing of camps and halls? How do we redirect that to youth development for both young people who are exiting the system, young people who are exiting the foster care system, but also young people who haven't had contact? How do we build comprehensive services and resource comprehensive services in local communities? And one thing that we have done in South Los Angeles is that we've tried to do an inventory and a community assessment of what services actually exist and what populations actually exist. So another example, and I just want to highlight so that there's a sense, that same pot of money we keep talking about in LA County, there's an agency that services probation populations. Probation officers actually call this agency on a regular, can you come by? I have somebody who needs services, yet that person cannot get a contract from the LA County, right? And so those are things that we need to fix. in order to actually provide comprehensive services in the community by people who have roots in that community, because research, community-based research and other research has demonstrated services that are provided in the community by people in the community actually have better outcomes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you. We'll bring up the next panel. Could I have Kim McGill from Youth Justice Coalition, George Galvez, Communities of United for Restorative Youth Justice, and Elizabeth Calvin, Human Rights Watch. And so I'll just end also on the last panel, because we probably will need your help. As part of the request for $100 million that Mr. Bonta and I are requesting, we're also saying that the distribution of money should not be done the traditional way, and that we are going to push to have the Department of Public Health distribute the money directly to community groups and basically circumvent the traditional way of sending it either through BSCC, through the counties, who then take administrative fee from it and dilute it, and as they were saying, sometimes doesn't get to the people that we want it to get to. And so we're talking about doing a paradigm shift in the way we distribute the money to our local community groups also. And so now on justice, reform, and reinvestment, what's underway? And we're going to start with Kim McGill from the Youth Justice Coalition.